We tend to treat the Karabiner 98k as the default bolt-action rifle of the Second World War. The standard issue. The baseline. And because it was so common, and because its operating principle was designed in the 19th century, it is often dismissed as archaic technology by the time it saw combat in 1939. But this framing misses the point entirely. The 98k was not simply a rifle that Germany carried into war. It was a weapon system refined specifically for a new kind of industrialized aggression, and its performance, its strengths, and its very real limitations directly shaped how infantry on both sides learned to fight, survive, and adapt. The misconception is that the 98k was just a shortened Great War veteran. The overlooked reality is that it was a conscious compromise, a deliberate calibration of firepower against mobility, and its story is less about the shots it fired and more about what its existence forced its users and its enemies to do in the spaces between those shots. The 98k was born not from peacetime innovation, but from hard interwar lessons about what actually kills soldiers in the field. To understand the 98k, you have to look past Mauser-Oberndorf and look instead at the trenches of 1918. The Gewehr 98 was a long weapon, over 4 feet, designed for massed volleys at extended ranges that simply did not exist on the Western Front by the end of the war. Fighting had become close, muddy, and chaotic. Soldiers carrying 7-foot rifles with bayonets fixed found themselves unable to traverse their weapons in a trench, unable to mount a machine gun tripod quickly, and unable to exit a half-track without catching the muzzle in the doorframe. The Reichswehr recognized that the next war would be one of movement, even if that movement was mechanized only in theory and largely foot-marched in reality. The 98k, adopted in 1935, took the existing Mauser action and cut nearly 6 inches from the barrel. It reduced weight by half a kilogram. It was not a new rifle. It was an old rifle optimized for the cramped interiors of armored cars, the mud of forward positions, and the reality that the average infantry engagement was occurring at 300 meters, not 800. This compromise came at a cost. The shorter barrel reduced muzzle velocity, which altered the trajectory and made long-range precision fire more difficult. But Germany made a conscious trade raw ballistic performance for practical handling. It was a decision that reflected a doctrine prioritizing the first hour of contact over the sustained firefight. But this rifle, optimized for rapid movement, was issued to an army that increasingly could not afford to move its soldiers. The relationship between the 98k and German logistics is one of the most under-examined dynamics of the war. By 1943, the rifle was being produced in 45 factories across occupied Europe, from Sauer and Sohn in Thuringia to Gustloff-Werke in Weimar, and even contracted out to Danish and Czech facilities. But this proliferation of production was not a sign of strength. It was a symptom of resource starvation. Late-war 98k receivers were milled from lower-grade steels. Stocks were laminated from compressed veneers because walnut was diverted to aircraft propellers. The fit and finish that collectors obsess over today, the smooth bolt throw, the deep bluing, was largely absent by 1944. What replaced it was functionality stripped of elegance. Parkerized surfaces. Dowel pins substituted for milled components. This was not a rifle declining in quality due to carelessness. It was a rifle declining in quality due to a deliberate strategic calculation that it was better to field a rough rifle now than a polished rifle too late. Soldiers on the Eastern Front did not complain about the lack of bluing. They complained that the rifle was too long to clear a room in Stalingrad and too slow to answer a PPS-41 at close range. So, the 98k was never intended to win a close-quarters fight. It was really meant to deliver precise fire from a supported position. But, by 1943, the Wehrmacht was rarely in a supported position. You know, what actually made the 98k exceptional wasn't its action, but its ability to make average soldiers dangerous at distances where their enemies just couldn't effectively reply. This is the tactical reality that's often lost when people discuss rate of fire. The M1 Garand gave the American infantrymen 8 semi-automatic rounds. The SVT-40 gave the Soviet marksman 10. The 98k gave the German soldier 5 rounds in a fixed magazine, fed from a stripper clip, requiring him to work the bolt between each shot. On paper, this looks inferior. But in practice, it actually forced German infantry to develop a discipline that their opponents did not always possess. The 98k, with its excellent iron sights and its 7.92 by 57mm round, was capable of accurate fire at 500 meters in the hands of a trained conscript. The average American soldier, equipped with the Garand, was effective at half that distance, not because the rifle was incapable, but because the doctrine emphasized volume. The German soldier, lacking volume, was trained to make the first shot count. This isn't romanticism. It's really the mathematics of ammunition expenditure versus casualty infliction. German units consistently reported lower rounds per kill ratios than Western Allied forces. Not because they were better marksmen by nature, but honestly, because their equipment forced them to behave as though every cartridge was the last one they would receive. By late 1944, when ammunition shortages became really acute, this ingrained discipline became a survival mechanism. The 98k was no longer a tool of offense. It was a tool of denial, slowing enemy movement, holding a tree line until nightfall, making the approach cost more than the objective actually justified. The endurance of the 98k in the post-war world, I think, reveals some uncomfortable truths about what happens to weapons when empires collapse. When Germany surrendered, millions of 98k rifles were distributed across the globe as the spoils of victory. France remilled thousands into entirely new calibers for use in Indochina. Norway adopted the rifle as its standard service weapon until the 1960s. Yugoslavia produced an unlicensed variant, the M48, well into the Cold War. But the most significant afterlife of the 98k was not military. It was paramilitary. The rifle became the tool of insurgencies, resistance movements, and militias from the forests of Eastern Europe to the mountains of the Middle East. This was not because the 98k was the best rifle available. It was because it was the rifle that was there. Millions of rounds of German wartime ammunition remained in warehouses, sealed in cans, corrosive but still functional. The rifle was simple enough to be maintained by a guerrilla fighter with just a cleaning rod and, well, even motor oil, and it was robust enough to survive decades of neglect. In this sense, the 98k transitioned from a weapon of state power to a weapon of anti-state power. It armed the Haganah during Israel's War of Independence. It armed the Viet Cong before the flood of Soviet aid. It also armed Cyprus, Algeria, and Cuba. The rifle designed to facilitate German domination of Europe became, through the strange arithmetic of history, the rifle that armed those resisting empires of all kinds. What the 98k ultimately demonstrates is that technological sophistication is not the same as tactical effectiveness. The bolt-action rifle was obsolete in 1939 by every measure of industrial warfare. It was slow, low capacity, and, demanded physical exertion for every shot. And yet it remained in frontline service until the very last day of the war. Not because Germany failed to develop a semi-automatic alternative. They did, in the G43, but because the logistics of war rarely align with the preferences of soldiers. The 98k was never the rifle the Wehrmacht wanted. It was the rifle the Wehrmacht could afford, in the numbers required, with the raw materials available, produced by laborers who were increasingly themselves prisoners of war. To understand this rifle is to understand that war is not fought with ideal equipment. It is fought with what remains after the first year, after the first setback, after the factories are bombed and, the supply lines are cut. The 98k is a monument not to German engineering, but to German desperation. And that is precisely why it matters. It is easy to study the weapons that won. There is more to learn from the weapons that merely endured. If you value historical analysis that moves beyond serial numbers and kill ratios, consider subscribing to War Machina. We take the time to understand not just what was built, but why it was needed, and what its existence meant for the men who carried it. Share this with someone who understands that history is not a collection of dates, but a conversation between the past and the present.